Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a conflict often called the Forgotten War, but for the millions who lived through it, and the soldiers who fought in it, the Korean War is anything but forgotten. It's a story of immense courage, profound sacrifice, and complex geopolitics that reshaped the modern world. We're going to move beyond the usual headlines and textbooks to uncover some of the lesser-known stories and perspectives that defined this pivotal moment in history. It all began on a quiet Sunday morning, June 25, 1950. In a swift and shocking move, nearly 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army stormed across the 38th parallel, the line dividing the Soviet-backed North from the US-backed South. This wasn't just a border skirmish, it was a full-scale invasion. The world watched, holding its breath. The newly formed United Nations faced its first major test. Would it act, or would it crumble like the League of Nations before it? The answer came quickly. The UN Security Council condemned the invasion and called for an international force to defend South Korea. This decision marked a historic precedent, committing troops from 21 countries to fight under one banner. The initial weeks were devastating for the South Korean and American forces. Pushed back relentlessly, they found themselves cornered in a tiny pocket of land around the port city of Busan. It seemed like the entire peninsula would fall. Morale was at an all-time low, but it was here, in the Busan perimeter, that they made their stand. For 6 brutal weeks, they held the line against overwhelming odds. This desperate defense bought crucial time for reinforcements and supplies to arrive, setting the stage for one of the most audacious military operations in history. That operation was the Incheon landing. General Douglas MacArthur, the charismatic and controversial commander of the UN forces, proposed a daring amphibious assault far behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. Military planners called it a 1 in 5,000 gamble. The tides were treacherous, the sea walls were high, and the city was defended. But MacArthur was convinced it was the only way to break the stalemate. On September 15, 1950, under the cover of naval bombardment, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The landing was a stunning success, catching the North Korean army completely by surprise, cutting their supply lines, and forcing a panicked retreat. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was liberated, and the tide of the war had dramatically turned. With the North Korean army in full retreat, UN forces pushed north, crossing the 38th parallel with a new goal of unifying Korea. They advanced rapidly, capturing the North Korean capital Pyongyang, and pushing all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China. Victory seemed within grasp, but a new formidable power was watching from across the river. China, concerned about a US allied nation on its border, had issued stern warnings, which were largely dismissed by MacArthur. In late October 1950, what the UN forces didn't know was that hundreds of thousands of Chinese people as volunteer army soldiers had secretly crossed into North Korea. The Chinese intervention was a massive shock. In the freezing cold of the North Korean winter, they launched a series of surprise attacks, overwhelming the unprepared and overstretched UN forces. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal retreats in US military history. The fighting was particularly fierce at the Chosin Reservoir, where Marines and soldiers found themselves surrounded and outnumbered, battling not only the enemy but also frostbite and starvation in temperatures that plunged far below zero. The frozen Chosin became a legend of survival and grit, a testament to the incredible endurance of the soldiers who fought their way out against impossible odds. After the initial shock of the Chinese intervention, the front lines eventually stabilized roughly back around the 38th parallel. The war of rapid advances and retreats was over. Now began a grueling war of attrition. For the next 2 years, the fighting devolved into a brutal stalemate. Reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I, battles were fought for control of strategic hills, with names that would be seared into the memories of veterans. Pork Chop Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy. These were bloody, seesaw battles, where territory was gained and lost, inch by bloody inch, with horrific casualties on both sides for seemingly little strategic gain. While soldiers fought on the front lines, diplomats talked at the negotiating table. The armistice talks began in July 1951 but dragged on for too long. Frustrating years. The main sticking point was the issue of prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners held by the UN did not want to be sent back to their communist homelands. The communists insisted on forced repatriation, while the UN command stood firm on the principle of voluntary repatriation. This single issue prolonged the war and the bloodshed for 2 more years. It is a part of the story that highlights the human and ideological stakes that went far beyond the battlefield. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. The fighting stopped, but it was not a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire. A demilitarized zone, or DMZ, was established. A 4-kilometer-wide buffer zone that runs across the peninsula to this day. The war ended where it began, with Korea still divided. The conflict resulted in millions of casualties, the vast majority of them Korean civilians. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and families were torn apart, many never to be reunited. The Forgotten War left a deep and lasting scar on the Korean peninsula, a scar that remains unhealed. The Korean War was a defining conflict of the Cold War, setting the stage for decades of global tension. It demonstrated the new reality of limited warfare in the nuclear age and solidified the division of the world into two opposing blocs. For the veterans who fought there, it was a brutal and often confusing war, overshadowed by World War II and Vietnam. But their service, the stories of civilian resilience, and the complex history of the conflict deserve to be remembered. It's a story that reminds us of the profound human cost of war and the enduring quest for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. If you found this story compelling and want to learn more about the pivotal moments that shaped our world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these important histories to light. We'll see you in the next one.